In this workshop, I want to talk about plein air painting and what it means to paint outside, with all the opportunities and restrictions you face when painting outdoors. So, thinking about a space, representing a space while being in the space, and the freedoms and restrictions you face. So, weeks I've been painting outside, mostly in the town more, in Jasmine or the areas around Newcastle. And in this workshop, I want to speak about those aspects of painting outside, and also mention very practical issues of, for example, fixing the canvas or your board on the easel, thinking of transporting your painting while it is still wet, or what do you do when suddenly a change of light or weather happens while you're still painting. Limiting the time you spend on a painting can be seen as a productive strategy. And as you can see, it is not necessary to have an easel, a lamppost, architectural features, or anything else can help you to fix your canvas or paper or board. In my practice, I have been drawn to outside painting for a long time. So oil sketches in busy city centers or landscape paintings interested me for particular reasons. In a similar way as I'm looking for limitations in my paintings, such as limiting the color palette, for example, I'm also interested in the fact to what extent the limitation of time I spend on paintings painting outside means a certain limitation of time. The immediate or unmediated response to the surrounding space became an important part in my artistic practice, and it was almost a logical step to explore the surrounding where I was living. So my interest in the depiction of the environment has then also moved slowly from, you might say, an accurate representation of the environment towards a more abstract representation of space. And this gave me an opportunity to think and structure spaces differently, slightly disconnected from perspective conventions we are very used to. I've been influenced in my work by a group of painters called the West Coast Painter in the 60s, such as Richard Diebenkorn, David Park, and their understanding of space and landscape as both abstraction and figuration at the same time. So this is not intended to be a step-by-step painting guide. First, I think you're probably very familiar with the use of acrylic paint and oil paints. But more importantly, I'm a strong believer in the idea of learning through making. So exploring paint while using the paint. And everybody needs to figure out what is the most efficient use of paint for your personal purposes or projects. So you might say, what is the reason to paint outside? What are the advantages when you can also work in the studio? So the reason for that are actually quite clear. You need to think on your feet. You have to come up with shortcuts, with ideas very quickly, and you can't come back to the painting or revisit it days later because the scenery, the weather has changed. So this ability or this challenge to paint very quickly, think about painting as a very immediate response to the surrounding, that's the purpose of this workshop. All the paintings you can see in this video were created in September 2020 in Newcastle in the town mall. And this is clearly a practice-based approach where I painted almost every day outside. Less so with the purpose of creating finished work, but rather to create an archive of images which helps me to think about landscape and think about creating images. Some practical key points I want to mention here. The decision of working in a vertical or horizontal format. We often associate the vertical format with portraiture, while the horizontal format in a painting is often reserved for landscape painting. Which means the vertical image then for landscape painting brings up interesting questions. And the idea of seeing the landscape less as a backdrop than actually as an active figure in your painting. Coloring in the painting surface is, of course, a very useful way of starting the painting. This means that you don't see the white parts of the uncovered canvas or board glimpsing through the background, and you can, in addition, you can activate your paint while using the complementary color. Masking the edges of your painting with masking tape provides you not only with a clear edge, and you can focus on what's happening in the painting without being distracted by an uneven edge. It also helps to define the image frame and thinking of the landscape as part of a bigger image. The painting style I'm using could be described as alla prima painting style or wet-on-wet painting style, often used by impressionist artists and so on. Characteristically, it uses often primary colors in very thick layers and allows a very immediate response to the surrounding space. If you use very thick layers or thin layers to mark the space, to outline the shapes, while you use the thick impasto layers then to accentuate the brush strokes and creating contrast of the direction of brush strokes. I now want to move on to more theoretical aspects. I came across and I'm thinking about while I'm doing the painting, thinking in shapes rather than lines. So while we often use outlines in painting to render objects, we never see objects disconnected from the surrounding. So what does it mean? So when we think of a bright object, we cannot see the bright object without the dark surrounding. So only the dark surrounding makes the bright object stand out. So background and foreground are closely interconnected. There's definitely no hierarchy between the one and the other. And we can't see the one without the other. So the foreground can't be seen without the background. And this is also reflected in the painting process. Now I want to speak about the challenge to show an open, almost empty space where we see no boundaries, objects, while Urban spaces show often clear boundaries of horizontal and vertical lines, and we can go back to the kind of perspective construction of spaces. In an open space, this becomes more challenging. I think it also forces you to think about the organization of space and how this organization might depart from a more naturalistic depiction of the surrounding. So thinking, for example, of mountains, trees, it becomes clearly difficult to show every detail of the object in your painting. So the naturalistic rendering becomes less appropriate, and at least for the purpose of this workshop. And you need to come up with strategies. How do you show the landscape without showing every piece of grass or every leaf on a tree? The corners of a painting can be seen as access points to the painting, allowing the viewer, if you want, an entry into the painting. Following this idea, then, the left top corner and the bottom right corner follows almost the kind of Western reading direction from the top left to bottom right on a page. So those points are very relevant in a painting. I also want you to think about the idea of what happens when the actually center of the painting is empty and everything happens on the edge, on the fringe of the painting. We have mentioned the figure ground or the foreground and background relationship before, and I've said how those kinds of two sides are really interconnected. It has also been described as a key aspect in the painting process in general. So James Elkins talked about this extensively. So how you distinguish the idea of fore and background seems very obvious. So in the foreground, shapes are closed. They have shown higher contrast. They are bigger, while things in the background are less defined, more diffused, and so on. That's the theory. And looking at the space in practice makes things often less clear. I think this is a great opportunity again to think about the construction of fore and background and how you as a painter structure the image in placing purposefully something in the foreground to mark the difference between fore and background. So placing objects, structured objects, in the corners, in the foreground, to mark the difference to the background. Finally, I want to talk about the aspect of brushstrokes and the direction of brushstrokes. And of course, the brushstrokes often highlight the space. So you have the flat areas and respective brushstrokes showing the plane area, while vertical lines indicate often objects or obstacles in this area. But what happens if the brushstroke differ from the organization of the space? And furthermore, the brushstrokes underline a structure opposite to the external space. The art theorist Rudolf Arnheim speaks about the twofoldness of the painting canvas. So where on the one side things happen on the canvas, on the painting surface, on the other we see the representation of a space. So surface versus representation. And both aspects, both sides can stand in a certain tension. They can go together, but they can also diverge from each other. I hope you found some of the ideas I mentioned useful. This hasn't been intended as a step-by-step painting guide. I rather wanted you to think about painting and rethink the idea of outdoor painting. And at the end of this workshop now, I want to come back to the beginning of the video where I spoke about my interest in painting outdoor and representation of spaces. And I found in particular this space of the town mall, this flat and empty area, particularly useful to rethink the idea of representation of space, where I couldn't go back to perspective conventions or familiar representation of objects, but I had to rethink how to depict this empty space.